It was December 1941 at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. The air in the conference room was thick with cigarette smoke and the heavy scent of pine from the forest outside. Maps of the Russian front covered every inch of the long oak table. German generals, men with monocles and iron crosses, stood in small groups, whispering about the freezing temperatures near Moscow. But today, the conversation shifted to a new topic: America. News had just arrived that Germany was now officially at war with the United States. You might expect the mood to be tense. You might expect these seasoned commanders to worry about facing a new industrial giant. Instead, a strange sound filled the room. Laughter. It started with one high-ranking Luftwaffe officer and spread to the army field marshals. To them, the very idea of American soldiers fighting the Wehrmacht was a joke. Hermann Goering, the head of the German Air Force, leaned back in his leather chair and swirled his cognac. He famously declared that Americans were good for only two things: making refrigerators and razor blades. The room erupted in amusement. The generals pictured American men not as soldiers, but as cowboys and gangsters they had seen in Hollywood movies. They imagined undisciplined boys who spent their time dancing to jazz music and driving flashy cars, not marching in formation. An intelligence officer placed a file on the table titled United States Military Potential. He opened it to show photos of American training camps. The generals crowded around, smirking at what they saw. The soldiers in the pictures looked relaxed, chewing gum, hands in their pockets. Their uniforms looked loose and unmilitary compared to the sharp, terrifying precision of the German SS. One general pointed at a photo of a US Army training exercise in Louisiana. "Look at them," he scoffed. "They are using trucks with tank painted on the side because they don't have real armor. They are children playing war." The mockery continued. The German high command believed that a nation of mixed cultures, immigrants, and soft living could never produce a warrior class. They looked at their own troops hardened by years of combat in Poland, France, and Russia, and felt superior in every way. They called the Americans Kriegsamateur, war amateurs. They believed the Atlantic Ocean was too wide, and American society was too divided to ever launch a real attack on Fortress Europe. But in their arrogance, these generals were blind. They were looking at the wrong photos. They were focusing on the cowboys and the jazz dancers, but they completely ignored what was happening behind the scenes in cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle. They didn't look at the smokestacks beginning to rise. They didn't hear the roar of assembly lines that were switching from making toasters to making monsters. They laughed at the cowboys because they didn't know what was coming. They couldn't imagine that these soft Americans were about to build the greatest air armada in human history. They couldn't foresee that the blue skies over Germany, currently ruled by the Luftwaffe, would soon turn black with the wings of 1,000 bombers. The generals finished their drinks and went back to planning the Eastern Front, dismissing America as a nuisance. It was the last time they would ever laugh about the United States. While the German high command was busy laughing at cowboys and refrigerator makers, a transformation was occurring in America that the world had never seen before. It was a mobilization of human and industrial power so vast, it felt less like a military buildup and more like a tectonic shift of the earth itself. The German generals based their strategy on what they saw in 1939, but by 1942, the America they thought they knew had vanished. The soft lifestyle the Nazis mocked was being forged into steel. In Detroit, the automotive capital of the world, passenger car production didn't just slow down, it stopped completely. Overnight, the lines that once assembled Fords and Chevrolets were ripped out and replaced with jigs for tanks, jeeps, and aircraft engines. This was the arsenal of democracy coming to life. The Germans believed in craftsmanship, in meticulously engineered machines like the Tiger tank, built by hand over thousands of hours. They didn't understand that America was about to treat war like a product for the masses. At the Willow Run plant in Michigan, Henry Ford built a factory so massive it had its own weather system inside. The German generals had mocked American training because they used trucks with tank painted on them. Well, at Willow Run, a B-24 Liberator bomber, a massive, four-engine flying fortress, began rolling off the assembly line at a rate of one every 63 minutes, 1 hour. That was all it took for the Cowboys to build a machine that could carry 4 tons of explosives to Berlin. But it wasn't just the machines, it was the people. The Nazis believed their warrior race was biologically superior to the American melting pot. They were wrong. As the men went off to train, millions of American women, the famous Rosie the Riveters, stepped into the factories. They learned to weld, to rivet, and to assemble complex radar systems with a precision that rivaled the best German technicians. The social division the Germans hoped for never materialized. Instead, the threat of the Axis powers acted as a catalyst, fusing a fragmented nation into a single, focused weapon. By the time the German intelligence reports reached the desks of the generals in 1943, the numbers were so high they were dismissed as propaganda. They refused to believe a single nation could produce 300,000 aircraft and 80,000 tanks in just a few years. They still clung to the image of the gum-chewing, undisciplined boy in the Louisiana mud. They didn't realize that those boys were now flying the most advanced planes in the world, backed by a supply chain that stretched across 2 oceans. The giant had not just woken up, it had started building a hammer, and that hammer was about to swing. The sky over Europe was still relatively clear, but the first low rumble of distant engines was beginning to echo across the Atlantic. The laughter in Berlin was starting to fade, replaced by a nagging question. How do you fight an enemy that can replace its losses faster than you can count them? By early 1943, the German mockery of American cowboys was put to its first real test in the blistering sands of North Africa. At the Kasserine Pass, the veteran panzer divisions of Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, finally met the U.S. Army in major combat. Initially, the German generals felt vindicated. The Americans were green, their tactics were clumsy, and they suffered a stinging defeat. The German high command breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed their intelligence was right, the Americans were just war amateurs. But as the smoke cleared and the first groups of American prisoners were led into German lines, the atmosphere changed. German officers, who expected to see the soft, undisciplined boys from their reports, found themselves staring up at a different reality. The American soldiers were huge. Just like the Canadians they would encounter later, these Americans were significantly taller and broader than the average German infantryman. They weren't the gangsters of Hollywood. They were the sons of the Great Depression, who had survived by grit and hard labor. German medical officers began to notice a disturbing trend as they processed the captives. These cowboys were exceptionally well-fed and physically powerful. While Germany had been under rationing for years, the American soldiers possessed a level of health and stamina that came from a land of abundance. Their shoulders were wide from hauling crates in New York harbors or plowing fields in Kansas. When a German sergeant stood next to an American private, he often found himself looking up at a man who stood 6 feet tall or more, with arms thickened by industrial work. The German veterans, known for their cold professionalism, began to feel an unfamiliar prickle of unease. They noticed the American equipment was not the toy gear they had laughed at in Berlin. Every American soldier seemed to have a semi-automatic M1 Garand rifle, while the Germans were still bolt action. They noticed the Americans had more trucks, more radios, and more supplies than any army they had ever faced. One German officer noted in his diary that while they had better tactics, the Americans seemed to have an unlimited supply of everything, including giant men who refused to act like they were defeated. The most chilling realization for the German generals was the American energy. The Germans were tired. They had been at war for nearly 4 years. The Americans, however, arrived with a terrifying, youthful enthusiasm. They treated the war like a job that needed to be finished quickly so they could go home. They didn't march with goose steps. They moved with a loose, athletic confidence that suggested they weren't afraid of the Wehrmacht's reputation. The laughter in the German officers' mess began to grow quieter. They had won the battle at Kasserine, but they were starting to lose the psychological war. They realized that America hadn't sent boys. They had sent a generation of young giants backed by an industrial machine that never slept. The German generals realized they were no longer fighting a colonial militia, they were fighting a future superpower that was just beginning to find its stride. By mid-1943, the laughter in the German high command had completely died away, replaced by a sound that made the walls of their bunkers vibrate. A low, persistent hum that grew into a bone-shaking roar. The refrigerator makers that Hermann Goering had mocked were no longer just a theoretical threat. They had arrived in the clouds. The German generals, who once boasted about the technical superiority of their Messerschmitts, found themselves staring through binoculars at a sight that defied military logic. The sky over Germany was beginning to turn black. It wasn't the darkness of a storm, but the silhouette of 1,000 American heavy bombers, B-17, flying fortresses, and B-24 Liberators, flying in massive, disciplined combat boxes. The German intelligence files had called American pilots cowboys and amateurs. But these amateurs were flying machines so heavily armed that they were essentially mid-air fortresses, bristling with 50 caliber machine guns that could rip a German fighter to shreds before it even got close. The psychological shock to the German leadership was devastating. Goering had once promised that no enemy bomb would ever fall on the Ruhr, but now American armadas were flying deep into the heart of the Reich in broad daylight. The German generals watched in disbelief as their finest Luftwaffe aces were swarmed by hundreds of P-Sivogfira Thunderbolts and the long-range P-Eno Haltreds Mustangs. These American escort pilots moved with an aggressive, athletic confidence, treating dogfights like a high-stakes sport. They weren't fighting for glory or Lebensraum. They were fighting with a systematic, industrial efficiency to clear the path for the hammer to fall. Inside the German cities, the generals stood in the rubble of what were once elite industrial hubs. They saw the relentless reality of American production firsthand. If the Luftwaffe shot down 50 bombers one day, 100 more appeared the next morning. It was a staggering reversal of fortune that the German military mind, obsessed with quality over quantity, could not comprehend. They had focused on building a few perfect masterpieces of engineering, while the Americans were flooding the sky with an endless supply of rugged and deadly aircraft. The most terrifying realization for the German high command was that they could no longer hide. The American bombers weren't just hitting military targets, they were systematically dismantling the German war machine's nervous system, oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, and railway hubs. The German generals, who had once looked at photos of American boys and laughed at their soft uniforms, now had to look up at a sky that belonged to those very same boys. The Cowboys had traded their horses for massive engines of destruction, and the Gangsters had become the most disciplined aerial army in history. As the 1,000-bomber raids became a daily reality, the German leadership finally understood the harsh truth. You cannot win a war against an enemy that owns the sky and possesses an infinite reach. As the war progressed into 1944, a new and even more terrifying realization began to sink in for the German officers. They had spent years perfecting the warrior spirit, believing that bravery and superior tactics could overcome any obstacle. But the Americans were fighting a different kind of war. They weren't just fighting with bullets. They were fighting with an overwhelming, unstoppable tide of supplies. The German generals, who struggled to get enough fuel for a single tank battalion, watched in a state of psychological shock as the Cowboys treated resources like they were infinite. The first major blow to German morale didn't come from a bomb, but from a captured American supply truck. Inside, German soldiers didn't just find ammunition or spare parts. They found fresh chocolate, cigarettes, and most incredibly fresh bread that had been baked just days earlier in London and flown to the front. To a German soldier who had been surviving on sawdust-filled bread and watery soup, this was a devastating message. It meant the Americans were so powerful, and their system was so efficient, that they could afford to bring the comforts of home into the middle of a wasteland. The German High Command had mocked the American military as a civilian army of refrigerator makers. Now, they saw the terrifying truth. The Americans were winning precisely because they were masters of industry. While German generals had to beg for horse-drawn wagons to move their supplies, every American infantry division was fully motorized. They had more trucks than the entire Wehrmacht combined. The Cowboys didn't march. They drove. They didn't run out of shells. They rained down steel in a constant time, on-target barrage that pulverized German positions before a single American soldier even stood up. There is a famous story from the Battle of the Bulge that perfectly captures this moment. A German officer captured an American position and found a birthday cake that had been sent to a soldier all the way from his family in the United States. The cake was still fresh. The officer reportedly turned to his men and said, "We have already lost. We are fighting people who can send a fresh cake across the Atlantic Ocean while we can't even get gasoline to our tanks 10 miles away." This was the logic of systems that the German military mind, obsessed with heroic combat, failed to understand. The Americans had turned war into a giant, high-speed delivery service. They built artificial harbors like the Mulberry ports in days, while the Germans thought it would take months. They laid pipelines under the ocean to pump fuel directly to their tanks. The German generals realized that they weren't just fighting men. They were fighting a factory that had grown legs and walked across the ocean. The mockery of 1941 was now a ghost that haunted every bunker. They finally understood that no amount of warrior spirit could stop an enemy that could outproduce, outfeed, and outsupply them 10 times over. By the summer of 1944, a deep, structural frustration began to settle into the minds of the German High Command. For years, German military philosophy had been obsessed with quality over quantity. They believed that one German Tiger tank, a masterpiece of engineering, was worth 10 American Shermans. On paper, they were right. A Tiger could destroy a Sherman from a mile away before the American tank even saw its enemy. But as the battles raged across France, the German generals began to realize they had fallen into a deadly trap of their own making. They had built luxury yachts of war complex, over-engineered machines that required constant maintenance and highly specialized parts. The Americans, whom they had mocked as refrigerator makers, had built Ford Model Ts of war. The German generals watched in disbelief as their elite panzer divisions were slowly paralyzed, not just by Allied fire, but by their own complexity. If a Tiger tank broke a transmission, it often had to be sent back to a factory in Germany or abandoned on the side of the road. But if a Sherman was damaged, the American Cowboys simply towed it to a mobile repair shop behind the lines, swapped the engine in a few hours, and sent it back into the fight. This was the industrial nightmare the German generals never saw coming. They had mocked American industry as soft, but that industry had created a system of standardized parts that made the U.S. Army the most repairable force in history. The German generals, who prided themselves on being warriors, found themselves being defeated by mechanics. They realized that the Americans weren't trying to build the perfect tank. They were building a perfect system of tanks. For every Tiger, the Germans managed to crawl onto the battlefield. The Americans arrived with 20 Shermans, backed by an endless supply of fuel, ammunition, and fresh crews. The psychological impact on the German leadership was profound. They saw that their obsession with engineering perfection had become a liability. They were fighting an enemy that didn't care about honor or artistry in weapon design. The Americans treated war like a massive construction project. When they hit a German defensive line, they didn't just charge it. They used their superior logistics to bring up thousands of tons of artillery shells and literally erase the geography of the German position. The mockery from 1941, the jokes about American boys playing with wooden guns, felt like a bitter memory from another lifetime. The German generals finally saw the harsh truth. They were fighting a civilization that had mastered the art of the assembly line. They realized that in modern war, 1,000 good enough machines will always destroy 100 perfect ones. The Cowboys had brought the factory to the front lines, and the German masters of war were being crushed by the sheer weight of American production. The sky was black with bombers, the roads were choked with trucks, and the German generals finally understood that you cannot defeat an enemy that views war as a problem of industrial output. By late 1944, a new kind of fear began to circulate among the German officer corps, a fear not of American machines, but of the American character. For decades, the German military had relied on Auftragstaktik, a system of command that allowed junior officers some flexibility. However, it still relied on a rigid, centuries-old warrior tradition. The German generals believed that, without their superior Prussian discipline, an army would crumble into a chaotic mob. This was why they had mocked the American Cowboys. They saw the Americans' casual attitude, their lack of a formal goose step, and their habit of questioning orders as signs of a second-rate military. But as the battle for Germany itself began, the generals saw the twist that would ruin their defenses. The very lack of discipline they had mocked turned out to be the Americans' greatest strength: individual initiative. The German generals watched in frustration as their carefully planned defensive lines were bypassed, not by grand maneuvers, but by small groups of American GIs who didn't wait for orders. When a German position knocked out an American tank or a platoon leader, the American private or corporal didn't freeze. He adapted. He took charge. He used his civilian common sense to solve military problems. The Germans realized that the American cowboy was, in reality, a master of improvisation. While German soldiers were often paralyzed if their superior was killed, the Americans fought like a decentralized network. They saw the war as a series of jobs to be done. If a bridge was blown, they didn't wait for a week for a specialized engineering battalion. They used their industrial knowledge to fix it with whatever was lying around. One German general wrote in his memoirs that the Americans were the most dangerous enemy because you could never predict their behavior. They don't follow the manual, he noted. They follow the shortest path to victory. The psychological shock was deep. The German elite, who viewed themselves as warriors by blood, were being outfought by mechanics and clerks who treated combat like a high-stakes sport. The Americans brought an athletic, almost joyful aggression to the battlefield that the tired German veterans couldn't match. They used their superior communication, the walkie-talkie that the Germans had once laughed at, to coordinate lightning-fast strikes. Every time the Germans thought they had trapped an American unit, those cowboys would call in a massive artillery strike or air support within minutes. The mockery of 1,941 was dead. The German generals finally understood the harsh truth. They weren't fighting a mob of undisciplined boys. They were fighting a nation of individualists who had been trained by a free society to think for themselves. The soft lifestyle of America hadn't made them weak, it had made them versatile. As the American army pushed deeper into the heart of the Reich, the German leadership realized that their Prussian discipline was a cage, while the American cowboy spirit was a weapon they had no way to counter. By early 1945, the long wooden tables of Berlin were no longer covered in maps of conquest, but in reports of retreat. The laughter that had filled the air in 1941 was a ghost, replaced by the somber realization that the war amateurs were now at the gates of the Reich. But for many German generals, the most profound shock didn't happen on the battlefield. It happened behind barbed wire. As the Allied advance crushed the remaining German defenses, thousands of high-ranking officers and field marshals were captured. They were sent far across the Atlantic, to the very land they had once dismissed as a nation of cowboys and refrigerator makers. When the German generals arrived at prisoner-of-war camps in places like Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arizona, they experienced a psychological collapse. They stepped off the trains, expecting to see the chaotic, undisciplined society their propaganda had promised. Instead, they were met by American guards who stood like granite. These guards, many of them combat veterans, rotated back from the front, were towering figures well-fed, physically imposing, and possessing a quiet, professional confidence that was more terrifying than any shouted order. The German officers found themselves in a twist of cosmic proportions. They, the masters of war, were now forced to stand at attention as a 24-year-old American captain from Iowa gave them orders. They looked at the facilities and felt a deep sense of shame. While German civilians were starving and German cities were being turned to ash, the American POW camps provided clean barracks, hot showers, and 3 high-quality meals a day. The German generals realized that America was so wealthy and so industrially powerful that it could treat its enemies better than Germany could treat its own citizens. The most bitter pill to swallow was the realization of their own ignorance. In the camp libraries, German generals began to read American newspapers and books they had once called decadent. They saw the statistics of American production, the thousands of ships, the millions of vehicles, the endless stream of aircraft. They looked at the American guards, the cowboys, and saw not a mob, but a disciplined, technologically advanced society that had mastered the art of total war without losing its humanity. One captured general reportedly looked at his American guard, a tall, silent man with a silver star on his chest, and remarked to a fellow officer, "We were told they were weak. We were told they were a joke. But looking at this man, and looking at this camp, I realized we were fighting a future that we weren't prepared to understand." The mockery of 1,941 had been replaced by a crushing, harsh truth. The amateurs had not only won the war, they had built a world that made the Nazi vision look like a primitive relic of the past. The German leadership, sitting in the heart of the American Midwest, finally understood that the greatest mistake a military can make is to believe its own lies about the enemy's character. By the time the guns fell silent in May 1945, the high-ranking German officers, held in high-security facilities like Trent Park or Clinton, Mississippi, began a series of conversations that would eventually rewrite military history. These were the men who had spent their lives studying the art of war, men like Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Wilhelm von Thoma. In their private talks, which were often recorded by Allied intelligence, a common theme emerged, a profound, almost spiritual shock at how badly they had misjudged the American cowboy. One of the most striking admissions came from General von Thoma, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War and North Africa. After observing the American army's performance from Normandy to the Rhine, he remarked that the German high command had been victims of their own arrogance. He admitted that they had focused so much on the warrior spirit of the individual German soldier that they failed to see that the Americans had turned the entire nation into a single, coordinated warrior. The mockery of 1941, the jokes about refrigerator makers, had been replaced by a deep respect for American industrial military integration. The German generals realized that the American cowboy was not a symbol of lack of discipline, but a symbol of a new kind of warfare, the war of the technicians. They saw that the Americans didn't just fight for land, they fought to destroy the enemy's ability to exist. The German leadership, who once looked at photos of American training camps and laughed at the soft living, now had to admit that the American lifestyle, with its focus on cars, radios, and mass production, had accidentally created the perfect pool of talent for a high-tech, motorized war. Every American cowboy was, in effect, a mechanic, a driver, and a radio operator rolled into one. This was the twist that haunted their final years. They realized that their Prussian perfection had been a hollow shell compared to the American practicality. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most senior commanders, later noted that the American ability to react to the unexpected was their most terrifying quality. He admitted that while a German unit would wait for a perfect plan, an American unit would simply start moving and fix the problems as they went. The Cowboys didn't need a master plan because they were masters of the moment. The legacy of this underestimation became a permanent lesson in military academies worldwide. The German generals, sitting in their prison cells, finally understood the harsh truth. Victory in modern war is not decided by the bravery of the past, but by the systems of the future. They had mocked a giant because they didn't understand that the giant's strength came from its freedom and its factories. As they watched the American flags flying over their ruined cities, the masters of war finally accepted that they had been defeated by an enemy they were too proud to even acknowledge as a rival in 1941. As we look back at the grand theater of World War II, the story of the German generals mocking American cowboys serves as more than just a historical anecdote. It is a profound lesson in the danger of institutional pride. The laughter that echoed in the Berlin conference room in 1941 was not just a mistake of intelligence, it was a failure of mindset. The German high command fell into the oldest trap in military history. They judged an enemy's future potential by their own past prejudices. They looked at the cowboys and saw a lack of discipline, but they failed to see the strength of a free society. They looked at the refrigerator makers and saw a soft civilian population, but they failed to see the terrifying power of an industrial democracy that could turn its entire economy into a weapon. The German generals prided themselves on being masters of war, but they were ultimately defeated by masters of systems. They learned, through the bitter experience of defeat and imprisonment, that a warrior's spirit is meaningless if it is not backed by the relentless logic of the assembly line and the individual initiative of a free man. The shift in global power that occurred between 1941 and 1945 was permanent. The world that the German generals woke up to in their prisoner of war camps was a world led by the very amateurs they had once ridiculed. The Cowboys didn't just win the war, they established a new global order based on the very things the Nazis despised: mass production, technological integration, and the power of the common citizen. This was the ultimate twist. The people who were dismissed as being too soft for war turned out to be the most formidable warriors the world had ever seen. Today, military historians still study this period to remind leaders of one simple, harsh truth: never mistake a casual attitude for a lack of strength. The American soldiers who chewed gum, wrote letters home to their families, and joked with their comrades were the same men who flew through walls of flak and stormed the beaches of Normandy. They were the giants who guarded the prison camps, standing tall not because they were ordered to, but because they had earned their place as the defenders of a new era. The mockery is gone. The laughter has long since faded. What remains is a sobering reminder that arrogance is the first step toward defeat. The story of the German generals and the American cowboys teaches us that true power doesn't come from the sharpness of a goose step or the complexity of a single machine. It comes from the resilience of a nation's character and the depth of its industrial heart. As the last veterans of that era pass into history, let us remember the lesson they left behind. Underestimating your enemy is the most expensive mistake you can ever make.